I do withdraw.
Right. I'm calling the next speaker, Jacinda Ardern.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, just because Stephen Joyce says it does not make it true. That was an absolute load of rot that he had to spend a quarter of his speech trying to tell the rest of the country what Labor thinks. Well, I want to pick out one example of where he was completely misleading the public, and that was around the International Convention Centre. Labor has never said we were opposed to the idea of a convention centre, but we were never willing to make a trade-off that meant we would increase harm against our most vulnerable communities in order to develop it. And it didn't have to be an either or, Mr. Speaker. There were other options on the table. All we asked as a party was that we look at the options that didn't harm those who could least afford the harm of problem banning, Mr. Speaker.
There's a point of order. Paseta Samrutunga.
That member knows that in 2001, Helen Clark and her government clearly...
No, that is not a point of order, and we won't have that interjections like that. Jacinda Ardern.
Mr. Speaker, the chair is still upset from Select Committee today, clearly. But, Mr. Speaker, whatever this budget was, it was not a budget that acknowledged the struggle and the hard times that Kiwi families are having in this country right now. This budget was not a budget for the most vulnerable, and it was not a budget for our low-income New Zealanders. Sure, Mr. Speaker, there were some sticking plasters in there, and some of them we won't begrudge. Some of them we acknowledge that in the short term they were absolutely necessary. But it is absolutely foolish and negligent to refuse to acknowledge that programs like food in schools are just that, are a sticking plaster. We need to acknowledge, Mr. Speaker, that currently we are living in a low-wage economy. That currently things like working for families, which the Prime Minister holds up as the one great bastion that's stopping the recession from hurting our families the most, the thing that he actually originally called communism by stealth, is actually a subsidy for the fact that we have a low-wage economy. We are subsidising the fact that employers are not paying enough and sufficient wages for families to survive. Now, we have no qualms, though, about continuing to support those families in the way that they need. But we have to do something about the low-wage economy that members like Mr. Joyce have made even worse since he has taken office. Because, Mr. Speaker, things like food in schools, the $1.9 million per annum that the government announced yesterday, somewhat begrudgingly it must be acknowledged, yes, we're pleased to see it's there. Yes, we're pleased to see that the government has handed over 18 cents per week for every child in poverty to feed them. And I should note, Mr. Speaker, $40 million in this budget went to private schools. But yes, we are glad that that happened. But let's not be naive that this is somehow going to magically change the overall outcomes for those children. What we needed was a plan. We needed a plan to reduce what is a complex situation, and that is a plan to reduce child poverty. But what did we get instead? Well, if you ask Paula Bennett what it was that was in her portfolio, she probably would have claimed that, well, we haven't cut benefits. Well, actually, that's debatable. 50% of the people rocking up down at Wellington City Mission, 50% of them have been turned away from work and income for support, 50%. We've seen a tripling of sanctions under this government for families who are on government support. But what did she put into this budget? Well, she said we're going to procure en masse whiteware so it's cheaper for families who need to get a grant to purchase a new system of some description. Mr. Speaker, we have no problem with that. We're pleased that we're acknowledging that actually some families end up buying second-hand kit that breaks down and they have to purchase it again anyway. So great. But this again is only ever going to be a sticking plaster to a wider problem. A shiny new fridge that you can't afford to put food in or afford to indeed plug into a socket and run isn't going to lift overall a family out of a state of poverty. And that is what we need to start asking the big questions about. And for our community organisations who are working with these families, well, they didn't even just get crumbs, they got less than crumbs. A community response fund, Mr. Speaker, ends this budget. That means that over 290 organisations will be worse off after this budget. Now, one of the issues with that, Mr. Speaker, is that while this government claims that the Community Response Fund gave those organisations more money, A lot of them were in line for pathways to partnership, sustainable long-term funding. The Community Response Fund was a short-term plug that then they had to lose, and they're told by the government they're meant to be thankful for that. Mr. Speaker, the only organisation that was saved were Budget Advisory Services. This budget gives them an extra $1.5 million. But again, that is the equivalent for about $9,000 per service. And 80% of the increase in demand some of those services have seen a direct consequence of changes to government policy. So again, this is a government that's claiming it's rescuing these organisations when it's in fact causes their demand in the first place. And what has happened in health, particularly what happened in health according to our most vulnerable? Well, we saw more money go into swabbing for rheumatic fever, but as we've constantly pointed out, cold, damp, overcrowded housing, factors related to child poverty are the causes, the precursors to rheumatic fever. Now, while the government has put some extra money into healthy housing checks, that actually equates to roughly $42 per child per annum. And for kids in Auckland only, Mr. Speaker, no matter what way you cut it, $42 per annum per child is not going to fix an overcrowded, damp house. And while that side of the House starts talking about its insulation scheme, functionally what they announced this budget was a cut to the insulation scheme program. And the only other thing, it was they have halved the insulation program in this country compared to what they were putting in previous years. And Mr. Speaker, they also claim that the warrant of fitness was somehow not only a response to the expert advisory group, but is one way that we're going to ensure that children in poverty are in warm, dry houses. The warrant of fitness only applies, according to that government, to state houses. 80% of children in poverty do not live in state houses. They will not be affected by that government's trialled warrant of fitness program. While on this side of the House, and they're considering a trial, we're considering the idea of whether or not cold, damp state houses is a good or bad thing. Absolutely outrageous. On this side of the House, we have committed to warrant of fitnesses across all rental properties. Across all rental properties, and that's exactly as it should be, Mr. Speaker. But we must, as I've said, go beyond stopgap measures, because not only have we seen the government pull out a cork and stick it in the dam, it's put it in the wrong part of the dam. We need much, much more than this if we are truly going to make a difference to this situation. And they don't have to look far, Mr. Speaker, for ideas. The Expert Advisory Committee on Child Poverty produced 24 working papers. These are summary documents of the work that they did. They produced 78 detailed recommendations. This was not a partisan group. These were members of the community who were experts in their field. It included Phil O'Reilly from Business New Zealand. They spent, Mr. Speaker, over 10 months coming up with ideas for that government to adopt. 10 months. And what did the government do? After they received that report, they took 5 months to produce a 13-page double-spaced report that they shoved into a folder when they released Food in Schools. They barely announced they were even responding. And what did they say, Mr. Speaker, in that report? They said, significant investments made over the past 4 years are testimony to the government's commitment to preventing child poverty and alleviating its impact. Low interest rates are helping New Zealand's families save more. Low interest rates, to get into the non-existent homes. And for low-income families, the government's 2010 tax cuts have made a difference. They've made a difference, all right. We are now the most unequal we have ever been, and those tax cuts were a significant part of us reaching that record. Mr. Speaker, the government's response to the expert advisory group, I think, quite frankly, was shameful. There was much that could have been said, even if they developed a longer-term plan setting out what they would do on child poverty. That would have been a start. But, Mr. Speaker, instead we have sticking plasters, swabbing and corks, none of it which will help our most vulnerable.
The Honourable Chester Borrows.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate the opportunity